Hello and welcome. I'm Jonathan Massey, Dean at the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to our lecture and panel conversation today. I'm going to say a little bit about the format of the event and the participants, and then I will introduce our main speaker, Deanna Van Buren. So what we have planned today is my short introduction, a half-hour lecture by Deanna Van Buren addressing the work of designing justice, designing spaces, and then we'll shift into about another half hour of conversation with a panel moderated by my Taubman College colleague, Anya Sirota, our associate dean, that will address racist structures embedded in the not-for-profit sector and some of the ways that they are interacting with community infrastructure. And joining Anya and Deanna for that part will be University of Michigan faculty member Matthew Countryman, along with two colleagues from the Ann Arbor area off campus, Yodit Mesfin-Johnson, who's president and CEO of NEW, a not-for-profit that you'll hear more about today, and Jessica Litaw, who is the founder of Building Matters, Ann Arbor, another not-for-profit that's active shaping our city and community. So that's the kind of plan we've got for you today. Thinking a little bit about our purpose today and our reason for organizing this conversation is that for the past year, the intersection of architecture and planning with racial equity and racial justice has been one of the most active conversations at Taubman College and in broader circles, professional and public. And so this has been an incredible year of student, faculty, alumni, and peer activism, self-analysis, learning and teaching around the ways that architecture and planning can advocate and promote justice in the through the built environment for a broad range of constituents and fellow humans. But many people at Taubman College and in the wider world have had this issue in focus for much longer than just the past year. And so this is a chance to take stock of some of the expertise that our presenters and panelists have developed and to think about our own knowledge base and history with this topic. And so one of the people who has been one of the clearest and most impactful voices on racial justice in the built environment is Deanna Van Buren. She is the executive director, design director, and co-founder of Designing Justice and Designing Spaces, DJDS. This is an architecture and real estate development not-for-profit based in Oakland, California, that is building infrastructure to end mass incarceration. As one of only 500 licensed Black female architects in the United States, Deanna is committed to racial equity in the built environment and has emerged as a national thought leader in advocating for alternative spaces for justice. In particular, formats like restorative justice centers, mobile resource villages, and peacemaking centers. And so we'll get to hear about and look at some of those projects shortly. Van Buren received her Bachelor of Science in Architecture at the University of Virginia, and she received a Master of Architecture from Columbia University. And she is the only architect to have been awarded the Rauschenberg Artist as Activist Fellowship. I first met Deanna and began learning from her several years ago when she and her colleagues designed a Peacemaking Center in Syracuse, New York, in context of university community partnerships aimed at connecting the capacities and the expertise of Syracuse University with folks in the near West Side neighborhood of downtown Syracuse, and also partnering to generate public scholarship that emerges when academics and community members and advocacy organizations partner to identify the needs of communities and the knowledge that we need to co-generate in order to meet those needs. And that was one of my earliest introductions to the role that architecture can play in restorative justice. And I think it resonates with some of the work that folks at Taubman College and across the University of Michigan campus are doing, including the Taubman Public Design Corps, that a group that started last summer and that some of you in the audience today have participated in. So with that, I would like to welcome Deanna Van Buren to Taubman College.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was such a nice intro. I'm so grateful to be here and to be invited to speak with you all today. I'm going to share my screen because I like to talk to the slides. Here, there are many steps. And we'll have a little sound action. There you go. Okay. So I always start my talks with a little bit of something personal, right? Because I believe this is a very personal journey. It is for all of us, really. And so I'll start there and then I sort of take you through how designing justice, designing places came to be. Like, how did a firm that's focused on ending mass incarceration, which is the mission of our organization, even come to be, and how I got there, right? It's been a 10-year journey. And it began really very young, right? The roots, right? I called it the learning to see phase of life. That's me, the little purple around it, right? You sort of see one of these kids doesn't look like the other kids. And the reason why is because my family had desegregated an all-white community in rural Virginia, really living in the wake of Jim Crow, right? So this is almost 10 years after Jim Crow. Not much had changed. There was a lot of hostility directed towards me and my family. From individuals, but also from systems, right? And the systems were very, very powerful and very in my face. And my father used to tell me, this is one system you do not want to be involved with, the criminal justice system. And he said this every time we went by the Stafford County Courthouse. And it's funny to show this slide to y'all because I'm in Stafford County right now down the road from this courthouse. And I would go by this building, right? The most expensive and powerful building in my town. As my father said, don't ever end up here, right? Just stay away from it. It's not a system that's fair to Black people. And so amidst all of this intensity, amidst this sort of aggression and the hostility and the fear, I would make small shelters for myself, right? I would go into the forest around my home. I would, in my house, in the backyard, I would build these spaces of refuge, and they were comforting for me. And so it was not a surprise that, given my primary way of self-care and nourishment was to build things, I went to architecture school. And when I got to architecture school, specifically Columbia, we were making blobs, right? This is what we were doing. And I didn't want to make blobs. And I was walking outside the school in Harlem, right down the road. And I was like, I don't think blobs are going to help my people, because this is what's looking like here. This is not a restorative place. There's not equity happening here. And I went to my dean at the time and I said, hey, can we start working in Harlem, right? Can we work down the road right next to this university and try to support folks who are living here? And he told me I was at the wrong school. I should go somewhere else. And so those were sort of the early, right, butting up against the system around trying to change the way that we as architects were working and what we were focusing on. So I took off. I left and went overseas. Left the United States, one of the best things I ever did. And I traveled all over the world working and just exploring in Europe and Australasia and the Middle East and in South America. And I was working for the 1%, right? I was working as a design lead on a lot of mixed use development projects, huge projects, like 300,000 square feet, over $1 billion, the wealthiest people, the Emirati of Dubai, the Tan family out of Malaysia, Bovis Lend Lease, massive stuff. And it was cool, right? I was designing in all these different cultural contexts. I had a sort of a very incredible, exciting job. But at the same time, I was seeing this, right? I was seeing all these informal settlements, this intense inequity. I was seeing the way construction workers who were building the projects I was working on, how they lived, right? And kind of in hovels. I went to Thailand and saw the trail people traveling, miles and miles just to get food for the family. I went traveling across the United States for months. And while I knew Black and brown communities didn't look good, I had not been to indigenous communities in the US and saw the way that they were living. And I just had to start to ask myself, y'all, why am I doing this? What is the purpose of being a designer, an architect? I know that there's value in beauty and necessity and power in the built environment. I've got to do something differently. And so I quit my job And I dove into the thing that my father told me never to do, right? The system he told me to stay away from. I decided that I wanted to use design to address systemic change around mass incarceration. And I became accountable to the folks who had been impacted by the system, but also their communities of care, right? The multiple generations of Black and Brown folks disproportionately impacted by this system who can't even meet their basic daily needs. Right? And these were the folks I wanted to work for. These were my clients. This is who I was going to serve. And I was like, hearing all the time from folks, well, what does architecture have to do with this? What impact do we have? And I was like, well, this is how we are participating in these systems, right? We are the ones manifesting the ideas and philosophies of our society. And if our society believes that people are less than, if our society believes in punishment, we build it. We physically build racism, right, into the very fabric of our cities and towns. And so the question became not whether to make better versions of these, but we got to build some new stuff, y'all. And what do we build instead of this? And you always start with that open question, right? The hope in that. And I was inspired by restorative justice, right? I heard about this other system of justice, one that was predicated on the fact that when a harm had been done, right, you don't throw them in prison, but their questions are asked about what can they do to make amends? What does the survivor need to feel like there's repair, right? This is about repairing people and relationships, and that these processes were being ignited all over the world in the form of truth and reconciliation courts and victim offender mediation. And I also saw that nobody was designing for this, right? If this is the belief we want to have, then as an architect, I'm obligated to begin to manifest this in the built environment. And I didn't know how. So I was able to love cross-disciplinary collaboration. I met a woman named Barb Taves, social worker, and we started to run the country's first design studios around the intersection of restorative justice and design with incarcerated men and women who knew more about this system than I ever would and had been on both sides of the harm. And it changed my life. And I was able to sort of understand more deeply what that experience was. And I learned tremendous amounts of things from all these men and women, an incredible amount of ideas. And at the same time, was starting to figure out how I could take those ideas and manifest them in built space when I got a call from the Center for Court Innovation in Syracuse, New York, which Jonathan was talking about, around the Near West Side Peacemaking Project. I had also at that time decided I needed some more skills, and I took training as a circle keeper. And I took my little training as a circle keeper, went to Syracuse, and started to work with the Center for Court Innovation, who were taking Native American peacemaking practices and for the very first time, bringing them into a non-Native community. And so it was a peacemaking center, right? They didn't exist. No one had seen them before. I didn't know what they needed or wanted. And this system, right, allows for folks coming in for quality of life crimes. I stole your car, or grabbed your purse. They're diverted out of court into community where elders in the community moderate the conflict so that folks never touch the system at all, right? This is the beauty of restorative justice. And so I partnered with Syracuse University, and I partnered with the Center for Court Innovation and a local community-based group. And you can see Mark Norman in this slide. That's where I first met Mark and Jonathan. And Mark was really my partner on the real estate side in this project, working with the community, running something we called the Peacemaking Palette, where we brought the community together to practice circle keeping, right? This is a new cultural practice. So how can your design process actually foment new ways of being? We were able to then diagram, right? Have them role play and diagram what kind of spaces we would need for peacemaking. And then at the same time, Mark and I were running all over the neighborhood trying to find a place for the center, right? We didn't have a site. This is the siteless version. And I learned a lot from Mark during that time. We were test fitting different things, and we finally found 601 Tully. And 601 Tully was already owned by Syracuse, and Marion Wilson, an artist, had started to renovate it as a gallery, and we were able to negotiate a deal for them to come in here, and we renovated it to be a peacemaking center. And it's been open now for 5 years. And when people come in here, it just communicates a different form of justice, right? It looks like a home, right? There's a kitchen and a living space and a circle space, and people were started to come here and choose to do peacemaking, right? Because they're like, this justice is for me. And when I called them last week, I just spoke with them. Believe me, all it's gone far beyond what I could have ever imagined. People are coming here, signing up for peacemaking. Police are dropping people off, right, rather than taking them downtown. We're starting to see youth coming here. They're having to expand their programming. People are having the quinceañeras here, their engagement parties here. It's improving social cohesion in the community. They don't have nearly enough space for the amount of circles they want to do, right? And this is the power of place, right? It's not just the program, it's the place itself that is beginning to amplify the practices and the process of peacemaking. And so at the same time, I was like, well, okay, well, this is working. Why don't we take the vision bigger? And I show this because this is what a planning and visionary process can do, right? We brought a lot of folks, stakeholders in my community in Oakland, the police, the county, the city representatives, some of the country's best restorative justice practitioners, activists into a room, like, what would it look like? What would the infrastructure that we need be if restorative justice or peacemaking was the primary way of addressing harm in our communities? And what we found is it's this beautiful distributed network of justice, small justice hubs like the Syracuse Peacemaking Center that would be tied to his existing infrastructure. And out of this, you see again the little purple circle came an actual prototype, right? So just through this visioning, Restore Oakland emerged. We're like, hey, why don't we create restorative justice and restorative economic centers? And this is the first in the country of its kind. And what we did was we were able to, I learned from Mark, right? Inspired by Mark's, it was like, okay, we've got to do real estate and architecture together. And we helped our client locate this building, negotiate the purchase and sale agreement, did full architectural services. We gutted this building, a 100-year-old building, and we turned it into three things. And on the ground floor is the restorative economics anchor of Colors Restaurant. And they train low-wage restaurant workers to get living wage jobs and fine dining. It incubates small food businesses, and it has the largest fine dining training kitchen in the United States. And then on the upper level, we have beautiful community organizing space for the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, Casa Justa Just Cause, doing immigrant rights and tenant rights. People can come here to fight their landlords. And then it also has the county's first dedicated space for restorative justice. So young people are getting diverted out of court into this space, but now they're doing restorative justice with community members, with folks who live in the building. And it's all that happens here. And so that project has been very impactful as a model, right? A hub, a multi-tenant, multi-use hub for justice, all forms of justice, as a model of what to build instead of prisons and jails. And, you know, I live in the Bay Area, right? And the tech industry is everywhere. It's a tremendous wealth, but the Black communities, most of them are looking like this, right? There's been huge disinvestment and huge urgency, and buildings take time, right? They take a long time to do. And so we started to develop a different kind of infrastructure that emerged out of the community. And it was a pop-up infrastructure. And our PopUp Village grew after 2 years of community engagement. And it's better for me just to show the video rather than talk about it. And I hope that it works, because I may not have pressed the sound. Actually, I don't think I did. So I'm just going to talk about it here. I will show it later. But the PopUp Village is a constellation of resources that pop up. It activates blighted space, right? We have shops for micro entrepreneurs. We have live demonstrations, food demonstrations. We have a whole youth zone, right? People can get the acupuncture, people can get their hair cut, people can get AIDS testing, right? So it's a place where people are able to come together and get resources in a non-stigmatized way, and it travels all over the Bay Area. And we also evaluated this project, right? So is our work having impact? That's been a huge focus for us. And we are very fortunate to see that, yep, the PopUp Village is supporting community cohesion, right? People are starting to build relationships, which is really what keeps us safe. People were getting increased in access to resources, and our local entrepreneurs were starting to grow and build their businesses. So this restorative and economics component was getting built out in a mobile way. And so I put this slide up because I keep feeling like, I keep saying the urgency is now, right? Every time I say that, something new happens that makes it feel more urgent and intense, this work, right? And I need you all to join me for. After the uprisings last year, we were getting calls from all over the country saying, look, we need to rethink things, right? You're right, the system is structurally racist, right? Everyone's kind of waking up to something that we've known for a long time. And so one of our primary communications and ways of working that we've been really building out is this igniting of radical imagination, right? That people have got to think beyond what we've always known. And our incredible expertise, right, and gift as creative people, right, as designers, is that we can help do this. You know, we can help people move into an elastic mindset that moves them out of what they know. And we create tools at DJDS. We have tons of tools that teach people about design, right? We democratize design, and gets us the information and data we need to know what to build and how. And so that process has become quite refined, and we call it our concept development process. And that involves the development of the design, right? What does it visually look like? The financial modeling around it. We work very closely with program providers. And now we're finding we're working a lot with policy folks, right? And at the end of this process, you have a really true, it's like R&D, right? We do R&D on all other kinds of products. Why don't we do R&D for architecture? And we're able to leverage this investment to really build the projects. And that sort of prototype that gets built, right, aligned with our program values, gets evaluated, and then we want to replicate the hell out of it, right? We want to get this. We don't just want one. We don't want one in one city. We want hundreds and thousands of them. And so I'll show you some of those prototypes. Some, I count Peacemaking Center in Syracuse a prototype. The PopUp Village is a prototype. But if we want to end mass incarceration, we have to support folks coming home. We know a lot of them are coming home. And so some of our prototypes are specifically addressed to that, right? Our women's mobile refuge trailer supports women released from jail in the middle of the night. So I work with 60 women in the San Francisco County Jail. They told me exactly what to do, right? I was like, oh, they want beds. They don't want beds, y'all. They get out, they want to be ready to go, right? They want to change of clothes. They want to meet with their caseworker. They want to meet with their caseworker, right? They want to get some food, right? They want to prepare. And so this is also used for survivors of sex trafficking. And right now during COVID has been used to support unhoused women. And it also anchors our PopUp Village. The mobile refuge rooms, again, small and mighty piece of infrastructure. These are rooms, these are spaces that provide dignity and privacy to men and women coming home. They're mandated to live in transitional supportive housing. They're crammed into rooms, like 10 in a room with just a bed or a cot really, and a side table. And we worked with incarcerated men and women to design these and to fabricate them with a local community college. So the folks who designed it were also earning living wage jobs. And this is also our first patent. And we are working with the Haas School of Business to create a plan in order to get this to scale. And then the last piece has been, how do we work with Black churches to create reentry campuses, right? So those mobile refuge rooms can go into these buildings and these typologies, given that we need social enterprise in here. They need to be access to a therapist, right? Classrooms, communal space, and that Black churches can really play a role in making sure that the communities get integrated and are able to receive folks coming home. So you can imagine, if everyone's coming home, guess what's left, y'all? It's this stuff, and there's a lot of it. I'm screaming at my top of my lungs to architects and planners that this is the next prototype we've got to begin to address, because they sit empty. They become a public health issue. They're already a public health issue. They also get flipped and become ICE detention facilities, because if you have it there, someone wants to incarcerate someone else there. So they have to be looked at and repurposed. And so we actually started looking at some of this in Detroit, with the Detroit Justice Center around the failed jail site that was in Detroit, and working with young people. Like, they were going to build all these youth detention beds, and the youth were like, no, we don't need that. And they had amazing ideas for what to build instead. And it was helpful us to begin this process, because we then took it to Atlanta and worked with the mayor and a group of community organizers, amazing community organizers. I'm telling you all, align yourself with the community organizers, because they really are saving our lives. The Racial Justice Action Center and Women on the Rise really brought us in to work with them to reimagine this 475,000 square foot jail that housed over 1,000 people, right? And is right downtown in a justice core, so typical. All our cities have them. If you go to your city, just take a look. You'll find your justice core, and to turn it into a center for equity. And we were able to develop really specialized tools. And we worked with hundreds and hundreds of Atlantans, a task force of 60 people, the mayor's office herself, to begin to imagine, what is a center for equity? What does it look like, right? What kind of uses would it have? And we were able to code and analyze that data and came up with these 9 pathways. And these are the same things that are in the PopUp Village, right? This sort of one-stop shop. We have this intersection of things, right? We keep siloing our infrastructure. And this is really what the community wanted, especially community hubs, places for them to be. And so we provided several things that they could do, like, let's repurpose this thing. We learned a lot about how to technically repurpose these facilities. You got to strip 40% of the skin off. You have to open it up. It has to be completely reimagined because it's done so much harm. And we have to gut the interior, right? You can't keep those cells, right? What are you going to turn that into? It's very, very upsetting to go in and turn those instead into community spaces like this, right? With daycare and places where they can have meetings, right? And exercise. And we gave them two other options, y'all. We gave them the renovations, but we also gave them like, hey, there's a center for equity. We could make a campus, we could demolish it, and we could turn it, distribute it around. And when the mayor is sitting with these options, right? And when we sent out a survey, take a guess on which ones the community wanted. It was not the first two. Right? They were like, tear that sucker down and let's do something new. And we're starting to do this work in LA County, in my own county, Alameda County, to begin to create these models of what do we do with this infrastructure. And so last, I want to show the work that really excites me the most, right? This is the most prevalent of the work that we're doing, is the restorative reinvestments in communities, right? We want to divest from the criminal justice system and invest in the communities most impacted. And I'm very excited to say that the biggest project we've ever done to date is happening in Detroit, not far from y'all. I'll be there next week. So it's funny that I'm talking from Stafford here, but I'll see you next week. And we are now moving into what I call the true execution of our business model as real estate developers. And it's starting with this building in the core city neighborhood of Detroit, the Love Building. And it was inspired by Restore Oakland, right? So we could already see replication happening. And this is an exciting multi-use, multi-tenant hub. We helped our client, Allied Media Projects, finance this project. We did a full visioning and master plan for them. And they will also have the Detroit Disability Power here. Detroit Justice Center will be here. The Detroit Narrative Agency, Mama Neza, is going to be burning out of the kitchen on the ground floor. It's going to be amazing. And it's under construction right now. And while we were doing that, we looked next door and we're like, hey, you guys are a little oversubscribed. Why don't we buy the adjacent parcels and expand this into the Love Campus, right? We call it a creative oasis for social justice. And the blue lots are the city-owned lots that we are now in due diligence on. And don't mess with my real estate development team, because they went after some of the nastiest developers in Detroit and won. And now we're going to, hopefully, if they're not nasty, purchase the purple sites, right? And that will fill out our development. Right now, we're looking at an arts and culture anchor, possibly Detroit Cinema. We're looking at Food Lab, Detroit Food Academy. We're looking at hospitality housing, right? Hyper urgent housing for folks coming home, a workforce development hub, talking to Isaac, who do social impact garment industry work. We're looking at digital fabrication, absolutely alternative justice spaces. We will have restorative justice here, y'all, for sure. Looking at de-escalation centers, classrooms, right? So this incredible expansion of something like Love Campus and Restore and Love Building into an entire campus. A way that we're working, which is something I hope we can talk a little bit more, is training local folks to really be driving this on the ground, right? This is Anthony and Marjan. Anthony is one of our designers on deck on the right. He was incarcerated for over 20 years. He's from Core City. He's getting trained in real estate development. I'm teaching him personally design workshop tools that he can use on the ground. He's out flyering right now for our event next week, our pop-up event on the site, and being able to have formerly incarcerated people lead our projects. And we're doing this in every city that we work in, training local folks to lead. And this is our new company tax structure, right? So we're a nonprofit that now owns a for-profit business entity that then owns single-purpose LLCs that can take private investment. So as we talk about the nonprofit structure, we are breaking out of that and trying to move into a more sustainable structure that uses other sources of revenue. And we've identified now, I'm excited to say, almost 8 categories of infrastructure that we believe have to be built in order to end mass incarceration and address structural inequity and end policing as we know it in our communities. And we want to have a prototype built in every single one of these categories, right? And we're well on our way. And we've started to create a tool. This is really a planning tool that has a glossary of all the buildings that we've seen, we've done, others have done, and puts them into a database. And you can bring in real world parcel data for your neighborhood, right? And begin to drag and drop the components that you feel you need as a community in order to end mass incarceration in the police state as we know it. And these refer to real world examples. So what you can then do is advocate for the kind of infrastructure you want. It tells you how much it costs, right? What programs were there? And so you can advocate. No, we don't need a jail, y'all. We need 8 restorative justice centers, 2 pop-up villages, and a Hope Reentry Campus, right? And this is our beta version of this tool. This is our team, all right? I love my team, so I got to show my team. And we're growing, which is great, scary and amazing. And so I'll leave you with, I hope a question to yourselves in terms of what you believe, right? Really doing inquiry on what you believe so that when you go out in the world as designers, creators, philosophers, you're building the right things. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Deanna. That was an amazing presentation, an amazing share. Thanks for inspiring us to consider ways that impact-driven prototypes could be imagined as new institutions. Thanks for showing us new cultural practices and new design tools to engage public discourse, instigating us to think about the way we organize ourselves as entities, and honestly for illustrating ways live that you ignite radical imaginations. So really appreciate being in conversation with you today. I'm Anya Sirota. Hi. Oops. I'm Anya Sirota, Associate Professor of Architecture and Associate Dean of Academic Initiatives and Principal of the Detroit-based Studio Ako Aki. I work at Taubman College. And I'm also a member of the Taubman Public Design Core Group. That is an initiative Jonathan mentioned aimed at broadening design social impact that's guided by principles of equity and inclusion. And I think we're going to be joined by the remainder of our panel presentation team now. Wonderful. Okay. Welcome, Yodit, Jessica, and Matthew. It is really a delight to have these experts, practitioners, scholars, and I think friends who work at the intersection of racial and social justice in the built environment and model how artists, designers, and professionals and scholars can also work as activists. So a very brief introduction of our group today. Please look into their work. Matthew Countryman is chair of the UM's Department of Afro-American and African Studies. Professor Countryman is the faculty director of the OVPR Arts of Citizenship program. Its Arts of Citizenship helps University of Michigan graduate students develop collaborative projects for community partners that address real-world challenges and enhance students' professional development. Welcome, Matthew. We're also joined by Yodit Mesfin-Johnson, President and Chief Executive Officer of Nonprofit Enterprise at Work, or NEW. As President and CEO, Yodit stewards the vision and strategic direction and overall operations at NEW. She joined NEW as a consultant in 2008. She served as Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of Strategy and became CEO in 2020. For her son, Yodit founded Black Men Read, a nonprofit that disrupts harmful narratives and uplifts the creativity of Black communities. And she also proudly serves on the boards of United Way, Washtenaw County, and We the People Opportunity Center. And welcome, Yodit. Finally, Jessica Leto. I am delighted to see her here. She is the Executive Director of Building Matters in Ann Arbor. Building Matters Ann Arbor inspires curiosity about and an appreciation of an agency over our built environment by illuminating and interpreting it. Their people and programs cultivate meaningful connections, civic engagement, and community transformation, grounding each program in compassion, empathy, and joy in support of Ann Arbor and a passionate pursuit of its brightest futures. They advocate for beauty, equity, diversity, and sustainability in the areas of architecture, urban planning, and construction, helping enrich the lives of Ann Arbor residents, visitors, learners, and leaders. So, welcome, Jessica. Here we are together, inspired by Deanna's talk. And I was wondering if we might kick off this conversation with a question about transforming paradigms. Deanna inspired us to think about not doing things as usual. She inspired us to think about dropping some orthodoxies and exploring more just and equitable ways of engaging with the world. Of course, this requires growing a pretty strong network. It requires for architects, designers, social entrepreneurs, activists, community leaders to collaborate together to alter perception, to introduce new and appropriate cultural processes to change our collective behavior, and like the practice of reconciliation, to nurture difficult dialogues among people from very varied perspectives. So pre-pandemic, this was difficult. Of course, as we enter this new endemic reality, it continues to be difficult. And I'm wondering if we might be able to share some methods from our own work about how we build these spaces to catalyze conversations that are true in their desire to create a space of exchange in order to transform perceptions. It's a long question. Matthew, I'm going to kick it over to you first to learn a little bit more about the work that you do and the kinds of conversations you kindle in the spaces for transformation that you build.
Thank you, Anya. So first, I need to update my introduction slightly. I'm actually the former faculty director for the program, and the program has a new name. So these are things that people should know. It's now called the Rackham Program in Public Scholarship, and it actually we just celebrated 10 years of work in Rackham, and so, but it does speak to the question you just asked. So let me say a word about the program. Which is now, in which I will find a way to get people a link to so they can see the program in operation. But it starts from the fundamental premise that graduate students can be collaborators in the kinds of social transformations that we're talking about here today, that they bring skill sets, commitments, visions, but that those skill sets and visions are best expressed in collaboration, right, with people doing work on the ground and in communities, and that these skill sets are best learned in that set of collaboration. We think our work is co-curricular in that it supports the work that people are doing in the classroom, but it is a vital set of skills that you can't learn in this classroom, that you need to learn in working in communities and in collaborations, and that you do so by finding ways that express. You can contribute to the kinds of social transformations that our speaker gave us a kind of glimpse into, and the power of those kinds of collaborations when you bring together all kinds of professionals, as well as community organizers, neighborhood residents, to work together to imagine, not just imagine a better world, but actually begin to work for those kinds of changes. We've been very lucky over the years to be able to work with graduate students from Tubman who in a number of our programs, and I just partly want to share the link so that people can see the kinds of opportunities available there. So I won't go on and on, but just to say that I've seen this work, right? That people and this is true for people trained in design and planning, right? That it's the exciting and important opportunity to work outside of the profession with others about how to change their communities is crucial. So that, and I can't say better than what Deanna said in her opening about what difference it makes when you get to do that kind of work. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, and thanks for updating the bio. If I could pass it over to Jessica for the same question, if you could guide us a little bit in the kinds of processes and spaces in which you work. That would be great.
I was really hoping to go after Yodit so I could just say everything that she said. So it's just as well that I have to come up with my own answer. So I so appreciate the work that Deanna and Yodit do in terms of creating physical space. I'm wearing multiple hats in this conversation. As you mentioned, I'm the executive director of Building Matters Ann Arbor. I also convene an online conversation called Ann Arbor Humans Who Wonk, which is policy-driven conversations around growth and development. I'm also a board member and this year chair of Ann Arbor's Downtown Development Authority, and a general community organizer and rebel rouser around housing and affordability. So I'm wearing all of those hats. And in those roles, I typically am not creating space. I'm in the spaces attempting to have those conversations. And what strikes me over and over again is power, right? Like, are these spaces of power or are these spaces of empowerment? Are we talking to, or are we talking with, or are we genuinely listening? And that last one is really hard to come by. So I am more attentive in this conversation to the dynamics we find in the spaces once we get there than in the creation of the space. And I think in that spirit, I'd rather give Deanna a little bit more time on this question.
Thanks, Jess. And thanks for having me here. And, you know, I am drawing on the formative years of growing up in Detroit, in a chocolate city, where I felt affirmed and seen and beloved. And I saw in place and in space, whether that was church or the grocery market or school or other spaces, I felt affirmed. And when I moved here to Washtenaw County in particular, I think one of the first feelings I had was the feeling of being the other. And maybe about 5 years ago at a Board of Commissioners meeting, I remember saying, I wish we would stop using the word affordable housing because it's coded language. I understood that that meant making space for the other. And that bothered me as a resident. It bothers me that in Washtenaw County in particular, while Black folks make up just 12% of the population, we are 60% of the people living at or below poverty. It bothers me, and why I created Black Men Read, that fewer than 2% of teachers are Black men, and that my boy, who I love and who inspires my activism, would to date be in schools here in Washtenaw County and not see one Black man in a leadership role. And so last spring, amid the pandemic, when I also saw a number of organizations that had committed to equity, inclusion, all of the jargon, abandon those efforts in light of the pandemic, we became concerned that the sort of crisis response would mean that we would abandon the important work of moving forward justice. And so we began convening and using at New our institutional sort of platform power, as Jess said, and privilege to uplift the voices of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, other people of color here, and to invite the community to listen and to be guided by their voices, their demands, and their invitations. And to do that from a space, to Deanna's point, of radical imagination, of love, and of a deep desire to see in our lifetimes the change that we'd often talked about, and to disrupt a often homogenous narrative in our community about what's needed. And so the Centering Justice, this monthly series that we've been hosting since last April, has brought together, at this point, thousands in our community. And tomorrow, as a matter of fact, we'll be talking with two of our Asian relatives and a Black woman, Berhinda Williams, about solidarity and about how communities of color can work in solidarity, particularly in light of the terrific horror in Atlanta last year. And finally, I would say with Jess and Matthew in particular, we recognized through the need to be in community and in space through our Champions for Change program. So 2 years ago, we started convening social change leaders in this community and asking them how we dismantle racism locally. And Jess and Matthew led our fellows through a history of this country, I beg your pardon, this community's racial history. And it got me thinking, and I'll just say this and wrap up, it got me thinking about the role of our space. We have a multi-tenant facility up on the north end of Main Street that sits obviously next to the beautiful Huron River on Indigenous lands and buttresses what had been a vibrant Black community here in Ann Arbor, and one that has since largely been erased. And thankfully, thanks to Matt and Jessica, we were able with our fellows to physically walk that space before COVID, and then we did it virtually in COVID, but to really shift and transform people's ideas of the space, which are largely informed by what they know now and not by the history here. So I think centering justice and champions for change are two of the ways. And now working with Deanna to reimagine our space, I think I'll talk about that a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to pass the conversation over to Deanna, this question of how do we build spaces that create transformation, but also to add the question of how do we engage people who might not agree with us? How do we open up the conversation and bring in maybe kind of agonistic space where there are difficult conversations to be had so that we can replicate and change perception more broadly?
Yeah, I think I will start with maybe the second one, Anya. And Yodit, I have some slides of your project too. So when you talk about it, I can show pictures. I like to show pictures. So yeah, we're very fortunate that our issue of ending mass incarceration happens to be a bipartisan issue, right? That we actually, both conservatives and liberals, both agree this thing is messed up for different reasons, right? But don't matter. We as an organization have chosen, and we're very clear, we talk to everybody, right? Everybody. I'm going to talk to the person who's incarcerated. I'm also going to talk to the correction officer. I'm going to talk to the judge. I'm going to talk to the queer trans folks who are, getting beat by the cops. We'll talk to all the people. And sometimes we get stopped from doing that, right? We've been blocked, but we always go in, and that's where we're coming from. We're clear about our values, right? We're clear about what we don't like. We're abolitionists, so don't get it twisted. We're not going to make that thing, but we'll talk to you. And then we believe, and what I found, creative practice really is a great way to get people coming together to have conversations. I've seen it happen time and time again, where we get opposing forces into a room around an idea, right, about place, right? Don't we all agree that we want places that are ABC? And I've seen people really let their guard down, right? Drop down into it and be starting to talk about it. Because I'm not talking about your ideology, we're talking about a place. So that's kind of the nice thing about being an architect, right? It's a little bit of a sidestep, we're just talking about a building. Yes, it's a building for transformation, but it's a building and it's a place. So that's been helpful. Is Anya still here? Oh, Anya's back. Good. I want to know if she wants me to keep talking about that piece, but I can also talk about the other. The other question you ask around how do we build spaces that are transformative. We have to be honest, the communities that we're working with, they don't know anything about the built environment, right? They don't know about how it gets done. It's been done to them. So half the battle for us is just getting folks to understand what we're talking about here, right? That this is how space happens. Here's how it gets paid for, right? Helping people to own stuff, helping people to think, to even imagine, oh, I could own that. Here's what ownership means. We're doing our theory of change right now, and we have 3 tenets of our theory of change. One is that when our projects are complete, our communities will be physically, emotionally, and relationally, their health and well-being will be increased. The second is that when we're finished with our projects, the community will have increased ownership and agency in the built environment, and that our projects will foment and anchor regenerative systems, right? Whether they be environmentally sustainable systems or socially sustainable systems. So I can't say that we've been successful yet on all those things. I think the projects are doing good. We've done some things. So also, I have to be honest, we don't know, right? Is it working? We've got to try things though, right? And the process is half the battle. So it definitely, if you don't have a process with the community leading and driving, it definitely won't be successful. But if you do, you got a little bit of a chance to make it happen. And it's a heavy lift, given the vast disinvestment and the trauma. We're in a field of trauma all the time, working with trauma. It's very hard work.
Thank you, Deanna. Sorry about the glitch. I was briefly knocked off, but I'm back.
No worries.
Deanna, one thing that you mentioned in your presentation was that I was struck by was the complex and engaging diagram of what your entity formation looks like moving forward as you explore restorative reinvestment, the nonprofit, the for-profit, the diversification of resources. This is a question about working to transform business as usual and rethinking the normative institutions, power structures, and predictable solutions that we have come to rely on, and rethinking our own business models. So with all of you here, I was wondering if we might be able to weigh in on structures that work for the end goals that we have in order to bring conversations about justice and equity to the foreground and also to make impact. But what are some of the evolving ideas that you have about entity formation, about how we organize ourselves, and what business models help us pursue those ends? And it's a question also about whether there are certain racist structures embedded in non-for-profit structures that we might be able to discuss or render explicit, and are there workarounds? You know, what do we do when we count so often for this kind of work on philanthropic dollars, but are also looking to diversify? So I know, Deanna, we ended with you, but maybe we can toss this to Yodit to help us make sense of how organizations work and what we can do to think about more equitable structures.
Yeah, in the moment, I'm thinking of Bell Hooks, who reminds us of the interlocking systems of racism, white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism. And I don't know that we can look at one without attending to all of them. I don't know that we can purely look at this from a, IRS or government designation, right? Although those are barriers, as Deanna lifted up in the end of her slide, and certainly one of the things that's on my mind a lot is how do we design outside of those structures? And so for us, that looks like deep relationship with across industry and across sector. And one of the project that Deanna is helping us with is to think about how can our history as a hub of social change morph to be a place where we can gather across industry. I really do believe that the revolution we long for is rooted in our relationships, and that we've got to get more proximate to one another. And one of the challenges we have is that we live in a community, at least in Washtenaw County, but all over this country, that is geographically segregated, economically segregated, racially segregated. And so, you could be in Ann Arbor and never see the deep disparity and inequity that's, 5 miles across the road. So for us, the answer to the structures are to acknowledge that they exist, and then to identify ways to work outside of them. Specifically, I think what we're seeing in the nonprofit sector emerge, importantly, is worker-led nonprofits, cooperatives, and other mechanisms that get us out of the philanthropy matrix. New is fortunate. The fact that we had a building given to us, speaking of conflicting political views, by someone who I would say is antithetical to our core values now, but had a vision in creating the space that allowed us to become a more flourishing organization. And I'm ever aware of that privilege, that we do not rely primarily on philanthropic dollars to exist. And we have for nearly 30 years been able to create a space where affordable meeting and leasing space can happen. And I'm hoping to expand upon our history and our reputation in that regard. While also inviting the private sector, the public sector, the healthcare sector, the education sector, et cetera, into our physical and built space, and into deeper relationship.
I think I want to say a few things about nonprofits. One of them is that I feel nonprofits are often a tacit admission that something is broken, that the government isn't going to fix and the market doesn't address. So we have a group of people come together to say, I see a problem, I can be a part of the solution, we can be a part of the solution, and so we have a nonprofit. The problem with that is that it exists outside of traditional resource flows. So we don't have money naturally flowing, money or people naturally flowing into nonprofits. So I am worried whenever I see people describe a nonprofit unqualified as this is the goal, like a nonprofit is doing this work. That's amazing. But it means that something is broken, and we are relying on a very small group of people and a huge amount of energy to fix it. And the barriers to those fixes are enormous. When Yodit references philanthropy, the white supremacy and the whiteness permeating philanthropy and the philanthropic culture is inescapable. When it comes to board culture, the people that we solicit to lead our nonprofits, whiteness again is a barrier towards true, not insurmountable, but a high barrier towards true collaboration and engagement. At every step of a nonprofit's formation, leadership, governance, sustainability, we are relying on inherently unsustainable structures. I very much appreciate Designing Justice, Designing Spaces, the model that they have about a nonprofit opening a for-profit, owning, if I understood correctly, Deanna, multiple smaller LLCs. I know Yodit thinks really thoughtfully about resource flows, how it goes through the organization, and how to make it sustainable for the humans that live there, right? Like, this work is so necessary. And also, because we live in a capitalist democracy, it will burn out the people that do it. So I just want to ask us to be a little bit more thoughtful when we're lauding nonprofits for doing necessary community work, that we're acknowledging the sacrifice that it takes to do it, and that we're being a lot more generous about the resources that we're sending their way.
Jessica, thank you so much for clarifying that and for that perspective. I'm wondering, Deanna, if you might be able to unpack a little bit further your strategic thinking behind that diagram of an alternate way of organizing the work.
It's funny, I've always, from the very beginning, I was like, looking at like, oh, should we be a nonprofit? Should we be a for-profit? Should we be a social enterprise? Like, what should we be? And I was researching and studying and finding that none of those models were going to get me exactly what I needed. And I decided to start the nonprofit with the full intention of creating a hybrid company tax structures. I started looking at them early on. I was like, we need all the money to do all the things. So I need your philanthropic dollars. I need my social impact investors. I need that. I need that. I need it all. And it's been very successful. And I think that right now, while we are predominantly philanthropically sponsored, as we start to build assets, right, we have a product we can sell now. We'll start to have assets that will be generating revenue from the sale of those products. We'll be generating revenue just from rents, right? People paying rent in our buildings. And my goal is to flip the 80-20 to 20-80. And so a small piece will be coming from philanthropy because it's been taken, philanthropic dollars has allowed us to kind of have control over the process and the work, because our built environment is predominantly built by developers, real estate developers. So people who have money, we all know what people who have a lot of money look like, right? The way that they're coming. So they're the ones creating it, or it's institutional, right? Or your tax dollars are paying for schools and things like that, right? And so who gets the best ones and who doesn't, right? So it's a mess. It's not equitable. And so us getting some control over that is absolutely essential. And we need all the capital. So I'm telling philanthropy, you are risk capital. I need your risk capital now. Later, I won't need you guys. But your job, and I hate to say reparations, but I will say it, is to give us the money to do the projects. Because I can't call my rich uncle to write me a check. I wish I could. So that's why I just tell them straight up, right? I'm just straight with them. And frankly, money was flowing to predominantly white firms doing this work for a long time, white male dominated firms. But lately in the last year or so, we've seen some flow in our direction. So
Deanna, just quickly on that note, thank you for saying reparations. And one of the things that we've become more bold and courageous about naming is the way that particularly corporate foundations built those coffers on the extraction and exploitation, often of poor Black and brown labor. And so that's our money, right, that you are putting back. And I expect that every foundation ought to become a spin down foundation and to put those resources back. And I think we have to be unapologetic about saying that. Something else is, I know Black women are going to set us free. And honey, that presentation that you offered is a reminder and an affirmation of our identity, and that when we get free, we set others free. And so I want to be explicit. Give us our money and bet on Black women.
Hell yeah, Yodit. Sorry, gotta say that. Huzzah.
There's Matthew. I have one question for you in this section, which is public institutions as opposed to nonprofits. An oasis or a mirage?
Thank you actually for asking that, because I've been thinking a lot about that issue as we had to listen to this conversation. But first I want to just go back to something that Deanna said quite a while back about trauma and about the sense of loss that people in our communities feel quite palpably, right, quite on a daily basis at the nature of the kind of disinvestment, but also processes of gentrification that have taken place, and in the ways in which outside capital and markets have really impacted their communities, and how that sense of trauma and loss constrains vision, right? I mean, that's the thing. The kind of hopelessness it generates, the sense of, and Yodit and Jess and I have had some experience with that, that sense of pain, right, and the ways it blinds us, I think, in some of our local work, and we've experimented with how we can tell the stories of the past loss in ways that are empowering rather than stop you, and that's been a real interesting and important challenge. And to connect that to your question, Anya, I do think there's an interesting. I mean, I'm an historian, right? So I think about these moments in the past. So much of the way we think about the post-war moment, particularly the 1960s, right, is about the trauma of urban renewal, Negro removal, as it was often called, right, and the ways in which the damage that caused to Black communities, to vibrant Black communities in Detroit, well-known, less well-known in places like Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor. But it's also important to remember that people worked against it. There were activists doing exactly this kind of work in trying to reimagine how they move forward from those kinds of traumas. And then one of the things that emerged out of that is the Model Cities program, which, while it had minimal impact because it was so short-circuited so fast by the politics of the late 1960s, but it really was a collaborative community bottom-up planning process that had the potential to remake communities in very interesting ways, entirely based on the public sector. And what went wrong is the public sector money just disappeared because of an election and things like that. But it is worth reminding ourselves both that is another place where it's our money, right, that should be utilized. And I'm an historian, so I'm not accountable for anything that happens tomorrow. But I will say that we're at a moment where it seems like it might be possible that those kinds of public dollars become available in certain kinds of ways again. Not, I would think, to displace the kinds of philanthropic or private sector investments you've been talking about, but as an additional source. And then maybe that's the key, right, is to not rely on one stream, but to have access to multiple streams and think of, and in each case, assert the right of our people, our communities, to claim our wealth, the wealth we created, right? And I'll just close with a very good friend of mine has just become mayor of Boston, the acting mayor of Boston. And she's announced today or yesterday, I think, that she's running for a full term, Kim Janey. This is not a partisan announcement, just to say that one of the things she's talked about, right, is that, right, the gap in wealth in Boston, right, where the average white family has about $250,000 in wealth and the average Black family has $8, not 8,000, but 8. And that again is exactly the issue that Yodi just said, the ways in which the wealth we have created has been taken, and not only from Black communities, but from all kinds of low income, low resource communities, and those communities have every right in the world to insist, whether it's through the public sector, whether it's through corporate philanthropy, whether it's nonprofit philanthropy, that this is not charity. This is our right to reclaim what was taken from us and to be able to use that in responsible ways to redevelop our communities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that opportunity.
Thanks for that. We're coming to the end of this hour, and if we have one more moment to spend together, this feels like a really critical inflection point where the pursuit of justice has become visibilized and has been rendered explicit in all kinds of spaces and through all sorts of narrative forms. And I'm wondering if we might be able to leave this conversation with an indication or an inspiration for how maybe young people can take this work forward, how they might get involved, what kind of, what can we leave our audience with who might want to question how further to pursue this kind of work. Yodit, you inspired me when you said that the revolution we long for is rooted in our relationships. This is true. So how do we begin, or how do we continue to build these relationships? How do we build on this work? And then for people new to this work, how do they get involved? I'm wondering if you might be able to maybe begin to take us there, if anyone wants to jump in to leave sort of last impressions of how this pursuit of justice that we're feeling now at this moment can be continued and nurtured.
Yeah, I will say that I feel like I'm entering the phase of Yelder, a young elder, and I'm very hopeful, given what I've seen from young people, and was recently talking with a friend. So I think what gives us hope is, what's giving me hope is a few things. One is, I do see evidence of the beloved community all around, as evidenced in our convening here, and as evidenced in the consciousness raising and the ways in which folks are stretching and reaching to more deeply understand and to have analysis of how we got where we are. I was inspired just this past couple of weeks, the ways that we push back on voter suppression in Atlanta, and regardless the motivation, the ways that corporations have put a stake in the ground. And I think that that's important. I think that we can draw upon Indigenous practices of dreaming and imagining 7 generations forward and 7 generations back. And so every bit of work that I'm doing now is for my children's grandchildren. And what the oppressor seeks to do is to rob us, as Matthew said, of our imagination, of our capacity to dream, of our capacity to long for a world free of oppression. And every conversation that we have that pushes back on that notion that we can't dream is a revolutionary, liberatory, and an act of justice. And so I think that that's the thing we can do as a collective. And then the only other invitation I have is that so often we think about DEI as something we do for others, for Black and Brown communities. And I've been challenging our white relatives to think about the ways they too need to heal from the harm of these systems. And so if I were to offer any advice or any consideration, it's that it is people that uphold racist practice and policies. And so when we heal, we can transform space and place. And thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much, Yodit. Jessica, would you like to, or Matthew? I see you, Matthew, you've unmuted.
either way, I'm going to be really short. So let me go first, and then I'll let Jessica say more. So I would just say that, how you do this work in communities is by being in community, by entering those communities as a as a collaborator, as somebody willing to work with and learn from others. The program, which the RACM program that I used to work with, or that I still work with and I used to run, has a number of training opportunities for grad students to think about how to enter those communities in those ways, particularly in a time in life when your time in a community may be brief, right? And so there's lots of good thoughts about how to do that in those trainings. And it is a skill set. I want to emphasize that this is not something you just show up with good intentions. And that's actually sometimes a problem. What you have to show up with is with skill sets and learn how and learn from and recognize you need to learn from people who've worked in those communities, how the community works and how you can connect with those communities. But the point is you show up, right? That's the thing. You demonstrate your commitment and your willingness to work, and you do so transparently, honestly about who you are, what you have to offer.
Thank you. Jessica?
It's a big question, and I'm so glad to go after Yodit and Matthew because I wanted to say a lot, and they said a couple of things I wanted to make sure I captured. One of them is, I'll say three short things, I hope. A local opportunity for engagement is in Ann Arbor, the Independent Community Police Oversight Commission. That was convened a few years ago in response to a specific event, but a generally understood need. They're incredibly active. There's work going on every month. Just last night at Ann Arbor City Council, there was a resolution to begin considering an unarmed community responder program. The resolution itself has already gotten a lot of conversation, and it will get a lot more as the community engagement over the coming year moves forward. So please get involved. It's ICPOC, the Independent Community Police Oversight Commission. I also want to entreat us to remember that while now is absolutely an inflection point, it's not unique and it's not the first. I'm reading right now a lot of Alice Walker's essays from the late 1960s and the early 1970s, and every word breaks my heart because it could have been written yesterday. How we have made a lot of change and a lot hasn't, and a lot of what hasn't has been white folks and our engagement and our understanding of our complicity in upholding broken systems. So I want to entreat especially white folks in the audience to, as Matthew said, it's not enough to show up with good intentions. We have to be showing up with skill sets. So again, do the reading of people that have come before us and take that reading. And the last thing that I want to say is make time to invest in radical dreams and radical imagination. We can't just break. We have to build. Deanna shows that with every single work, every single piece of work that she does, every word that she utters. We have to dream. It's not enough to break. We have to build. But we need all of us to do it. So read, listen, get involved, dream.
Thank you. And Deanna, if we could leave it off with you, there's a comment from Luciana who would like to see your work transplanted into other contexts, including Brazil. And if we could connect that idea of perhaps replicability or scalability, but also how to continue to inspire young people to do this kind of work. We'll leave it to you.
I don't know. I just think Yodit, Matthew, and Jessica, what they all just said was just beautiful, right? It perfectly said. And I agree with all of it. I would have said this, couldn't have said it better. So, I mean, replicability is, first, I think we need to learn across borders, right? The borders are not, they're fake and they're not helping us out. I have learned more from international travel, experience, exposure. One of the only other architects developing restorative justice spaces is in Bogota, Colombia. You know, my ass went to Bogota, Colombia to see it. I almost was in tears, right? To see a youth space and how he did it. And he had these curtains. It was like fantastic, right? So we have a lot to learn from each other, which to stay open to that potential and possibility. Just want to uplift what this beautiful panel has said about showing up, being ready, doing your healing work. I've just been reading My Grandmother's Hand, so I'm really intensely in it. I'm really in it now. I'm like, gotta read that book. That's the work, right? And I sometimes share, not always, but I've done a lot of personal work to be able to do what I'm doing. I had to do a lot of healing to get to this place. So I encourage folks, and I see so many young people out there now doing great like so engaged. I'm also, what'd you call it, Yodi? What am I? I'm a yelder? I think I'm a yelder. I've been looking at the youngsters, they're fired up, right? They need the training. Thank God Matthew's program. Oh my God, I wish I had a program like that when I was in school. We didn't have those resources. We didn't have those. So they exist. You all are bringing them. Use them.
I mean, on that note, these institutions have an obligation to our children too, to make sure that the curriculum, that the opportunities to learn, that the pedagogy speaks to them and doesn't uphold white supremacy and old structures. And so I think panels like this are important, but also making sure that we're getting out of the virtual or physical classroom and getting folks to community and into relationships is so important. The Academy has a lot of work to do.
Truth. Thank you so much, Yodit, Matthew, Jessica, Deanna, for your generosity, for your inspiration, for the sense of hope, and for the incredible work that you do. I'm humbled to be here with you today and extremely grateful for being able to participate. Thank you so much. And thanks to our audience for joining this conversation.